In 1585, Queen Elizabeth I of England sent a letter to Jalaluddin Muhammad Akbar, the powerful Mughal emperor of India, in an attempt to open trade relations between their two countries. 15 years later, she would grant the royal charter to a group of London merchants to trade with India. This would become the infamous East India Company, which would go on to assume military and administrative control over all of India, and in process intertwine the destiny of Britain and India for several centuries. We know a fair amount through our studies and movies about the British-Indian relations during the colonial period. However, what is much less discussed and understood is the period before the British became the occupiers and the oppressors, when the interactions were centered around trade and cultural exchange instead of conquest and domination. Today, we want to dive deeper into the nature of early British contact, not so much with the rulers, but with the people of India. What did they see here? What did they make of it? The day-to-day life of India, the colors, the smells, and the tastes of India from the British perspective. To this end, we have with us one of the finest experts on the subject, Dr. Ruchika Sharma, Assistant Professor of History at Gargi College, University of Delhi. Welcome to Argumentative Indians, Ruchika.
Thank you so much, Yajur. Thanks for having me here.
So we are really excited to hear the fascinating details about the early Indian-British interactions you have uncovered through your extensive study of British travelogues from this period. Please tell us, what were some of these early impressions of these British men who came to India as part of the East India Company?
Okay, I think I will want to start by expanding a little bit about the travel writings. I think we historians have a lot of sources that we study, and travel writing forms one of the finest and equally problematic sources of study. Why are they problematic? Because we have to keep in mind that people who are writing it, so in this case, the Britishers who have just come to India, we have to also find out where are these people coming from, what is their background very often, because it reflects in what they choose to write and what they pick up. Second, it's interesting is that they often mention details that you and I might think to be mundane and regular about our lives. So some details like women bathing at ghats, an everyday event of 17th, 16th centuries, seems like a fascinating thing enough to them that they will write passages about it. They'll make paintings on this theme. So we have to also keep in mind that the traveler will have a kind of gaze that will be fashioned and shaped by his experiences and the culture that he comes from. The third thing that probably will shape up what he will pick up or she will pick up to write will also be influenced by what they already know about India. So, once they first step foot on Indian shores, it is not that they had not heard about Hindustan, they had not heard about India, they had. So a lot of times we also need to know what was being written and how in a way it became like a corpus of literature, some in black and white, some in letters. So they are writing letters back at home to friends and family. They are making paintings, sketches. Some people are writing their diaries. Some people are writing memoirs. So we have so much of literature in forms of travelogues. So it's very interesting and fascinating sort of writing. At the same time, what is problematic about these writings is that while they write about their impressions, they often don't cross that line to speak with the people they are writing about. And to that end, I think travel writing becomes a very powerful sort of a action. You get the right to define us. You will tell other people who we are, not us in our voices, but you will represent us. So I think we have to keep these aspects and this politics of writing travel history in mind. It's knowledge. It's your knowledge of the other that I get to write, kind of a thing. The other thing that you very rightly said, that very often when we mention British, we only think of the colonial interaction. Yes, that is a part of our history, and we do. I think there are a lot of researchers, experts who have worked on that. But there are also now works happening on what is the shared space before the British became the colonial imperial structure that they were. So before that, or even during the early colonial era, I will mention some 18th and early 19th centuries, but there is often a shared space, a social space. They are living in a country where they are interacting, witnessing, talking to at times, living with as partners, having children with them. So many of these interpersonal, and where you very correctly said that these cultural spaces that they shared. So I want to say that travel writing has to be kept in mind as a very distinctive source of writing of history. Now, coming to what you asked, Yajur, how do they view Indian men and women? Now, travel writing is not a monolith. There is no one formulaic kind of writing that the Britishers were doing. They were fascinated by different things, and they would write those different things. Weather, of course, forms like obsessive writing of that. And rather than trying to connect weather to clothing, that people will dress up. So trying to say somebody is barely clothed. Very interesting term, barely clothed. How would one be totally covered if you're living in a warm country? So I think these are very fascinating choice of words at time. Also, the distinctions and divisions they make, it remain based on religion. So very often Hindu men, Muslim men is the division that we get. Hindu women, Muslim women is the division that we get. Sometimes also based on class, but they often do not delineate that as much. Sometimes they become regional. So women from Kashmir, men from Madras, Bengali, people of Awadh. So these geographical kind of identities are given. So I think this happens later also more and more once their approach towards Indian people becomes more ethnographic. That also starts to happen gradually when their role kind of transforms from traders to administrators to then the colonial power. A certain sense of race and a certain sense of making us typified into certain categories sort of starts to emerge. So I personally feel that in the beginning, the categories are more loose, Hindu and Muslim, which is also, I think, the reason behind that could also possibly be that they divide our history into Hindu era, Muslim era, and British era, to sort of say that how before we came, you all were fighting on the basis of religion, and how religious identity of the ruler was more important. But we are a civilizationally superior, entity, and that's how. But yes, religion. So for example, Hindu men are supposed to be gentle. They are supposed to be into cleanliness. So bathing is for them, it means cleanliness rather than looking at the ritualistic purpose. Muslim men often are portrayed. And also remember that back in Europe also there has been a history of anti-Islamic sort of relationship that Christianity has had. So that also sometimes shapes up the way they look at Muslims. Also to legitimize themselves and to also critique the Mughal Empire, sometimes the vilification of the Muslims sort of happens at times in these writings.
Got you. And when you mentioned that they were obsessed with weather, and religious regional distinctions of Indians were very important to them, the way they identified us. And when it comes to women, generally, what was like their point of view? What did they think of like Hindu women versus Muslim women? Or I'm just curious, what was their impression?
Yeah, so see, weather, for example, becomes a very integral point to how they experience India. Because whenever you reach a place first, the first physical sensation that you have in that place is the weather, right? So, and they had almost a lot of this, information about mosquitoes, about the weather, about this fever, that fever. In fact, the book Two Monsoons by Theon Wilkinson, he says that the average life of the British in India was 2 monsoons. So the probability was that you'll meet somebody for lunch and in the evening you'll go for their funeral because they would have passed by the time you reach back home. Now, it's also curious that when they reach India, they would continue to have the food the way they would, which of course, based on Indian tropical weather, might not have suited them, right? So a lot of, red meat, a lot of their own kind of wines that they would drink, heavy food, they would dress up in their clothes, the hats, the boots, which would not have been conducive to the weather they were living in. So weather then becomes a point of discomfort, but they also knew that they can't do much about it. They have to come around and accept the weather. The other thing that I found very interesting, I study wills actually, Ajur, so I'll bring a little bit of that in as well. Even in the wills where men would end up, living with Indian women, making families with them, and so this one person writes to his family in the will saying that I have these children here because the weather is like this. The weather, the languor of the weather compels. I remember reading a letter in my early research days, and I really cursed myself for not writing the reference down, where this British man writing to his wife back in at home is asking her to join back him because the weather here is such that it excites one too much. So you better join me here or less. So giving a kind of blackmailing her that I'll have a native concubine if you don't. So many such, also this very typical Orientalist kind of trope that women in the Oriental ripen, more easily, and the child marriage and the early marriage age, within tropical regions, also did not help when they developed this kind of arguments. I've also looked at some rape cases in the court cases of 17th, 18th century, sorry. And I see that women's age and the fact that native women ripen sexually early is often a logic that is mentioned even in the legal documents. Very often the maps that are drawn of not just India, but Africa also have very, very vague similarities with the female anatomy. And often women's bodies, especially African women's bodies, are highly sexualized. I will talk about Indian women's bodies as well, but I'm just giving you a background of how weather is often blamed for a lot of things. Somebody writes that Indian women's jealousy also comes because the weather is like this here. So these are some of the travel writings, how weather becomes an uneasy experience, but it's used to justify certain stereotypes of Indian people as well.
I think with the British, it's the obsession for weather doesn't only extend to foreign countries, even in their own country. I don't think there are any other people who tend to talk so much about weather as them.
True.
And so it's hardly surprising that they go to another land and don't start discussing the weather.
All the time.
So tell us more about this Orientalist attitude. Was it already well established when they came to India? I think they landed here in 1608 in Surat and then eventually started making factories around in the coastal areas. But was already there an attitude that we are here in the Orient and this is an exotic land and they do exotic things? Was that the frame of mind they came with?
I think this idea of the exotic was created by them. So we are not Orient, we are seen as Orient by them, right? So this kind of othering, this kind of making us into exotic was something that started with the Europeans coming to India. And we focus on British, of course, more because their experience in India transforms into, multiple stages, of course. But when you read their writing, when you read even not just the writing of Britishers, but even someone like Manucci or Bernier, even others, there is so much of this similarity of how they write about the bodies of the women or the weather or their experience. Sometimes it's identical. So, for example, this idea of sexualizing the food, for example. Now, I was reading that how French travelers did something similar with Ottoman harem, that how certain phallus-shaped vegetables would not be sent back into harem, intact. They'd be cut into pieces before being sent. Again, making a stereotype about the women who were living in the harem without ever having met those women, without ever having any interaction or any reason. So, there are scholars who talk about the bazaar gossip, that how they would pick up the bazaar gossip, fantasize about people they have never met. But yeah, what surprises me is that Manucci does the same. He's, Venetian. He writes about the Indian harem in 17th century the same way somebody before him has done about the Ottoman harem, and how this kind of, orientalizing or making us into the exotic beings, who are not just being studied and observed, but also also being created for somebody to read who might never travel to India. So we have to also keep in mind who their audiences are. Their audiences are not, us. Their audiences are people back at home dying to know about the exotic, Yeah.
Sex sells as much today as then. So, the concept they laid out was that there are really sex-starved women inside these harems, and was there any basis in truth, or was it because they had no accessibility to these places that they had the ability to sort of fantasize about what's going on there?
I think I would say it's the latter, because there is so much. Almost everybody would write about the women in the harem. Um, it's almost as if because they could not see those women, they will have much more to say about them, because and they will also that they have proof, they have invariable proof, they have heard from a eunuch or they would have heard from somebody, but they will never mention the person's name. And what remains amazing is that the range of how they mention these women in the harem will be, somebody would say, are they too beautiful, is that why they are hidden? Are they too ugly to look at, is that why they are hidden? So from their sexual lasciviousness to sexual licentiousness, it's almost like creating a scene of without ever having had even a peep into that scenario. But I think there was a larger motive behind that as well. The larger motive also was to construct the politics and the sexuality of the men in relation to those women as well, right? So there is this mention by an early writer to Akbar's court that how Akbar had 800 concubines. I don't think anywhere in the records I would. Somebody talks about how this is Jesuit priests who come to Akbar's court saying that how Akbar's infertility, because how he's not been able to father as many children as if he had so many wives. So you realize that so much of the focus remains on an emperor. I mean, we all know that there was a kind of a subtle this thing to make Akbar come to their side of religion, and Akbar being the curious person that he was. But yeah, these are very interesting to read the details when you read how they are being mentioned. So Jahangir is mentioned like that. Shah Jahan is mentioned that. In fact, Shah Jahan is mentioned for no apparent reason, that how he was unduly attached to his daughter, again hinting at a very kind of an incestuous sort of a relationship with no basis again. Now if you read the way in which it can be read as historians, it can be thought of as scholars, it would actually mean that through constructing the women in the harem, on one hand you're telling people so that we have lived here for so long that we know these things, but we also need to ask the questions, how would they know about these things? The only change that comes, Yajur, is when women start to travel, because women can actually enter the spaces of harem, right? And often the way they write is also riddled with gendered and racial tension. I also want to point out then that often when I read these sources, I feel that the way in which the white women are being mentioned, sometimes the white women are called chaste, morally pure, whereas Indian women's beauty is only outward beauty. And I feel that both the women are being constructed in the process. That as white men, they're constructing the Indian native women as much as they're constructing the white women. In fact, there's a person with the name Charles who's called Hindu Stewart, who describes the female form, and that how, because the white women wears these very tight fitting corsets which are made of whale fish's bones, which is why their bodies are slender, and the full-bodied Indian women look the way they do because they leave their bodies, take their natural course. Now, how much attention is being paid to both, but they're both being juxtaposed and compared simultaneously. So he's called Charles Hindu Stewart because of his utmost admiration for Hindu culture, actually. But yeah, it also has a gendered dimension to it, I feel.
So that's interesting. In both, could it possibly be because in those days the society was much more restrictive for women in the Western world? So so some of the less restrictive practices of India may have made them think that women here aren't as chaste as they are back in Britain. could it have some basis in that?
I think it's a lot more to do with the attitude towards sexuality, the attitudes, maybe some legal practices. For example, a concubinage and to have a child from a concubine was perfectly fine when the white men go to colonies, and not just in India, or not. I think everywhere they've gone, you will have the mixed race populations in those regions. But similar thing in England is not possible. I was reading this book the other day where it said that they were doing everything that was almost impossible to do back at home. Not to say things don't exist everywhere. I think this is just we would think they do not. Just because laws are made about something, it means they do exist, and somebody thinks they should not exist. That's why the law is made. But yes, I think the certain kind of prudery towards sexuality was definitely there. Even this attitude towards sexuality in medieval Europe is much more, I think, restrictive. So this idea of body and soul as two separate things, where the body and bodily desires should always necessarily be curbed. Whereas on the other hand, in Indic cultures, we find sensual and spiritual sort of coexisting. Similarly, in the Bhakti poetry, Riti poetry, Sufi poetry, we have juxtapositioning of devotion along with in a very sensual kind of language. I mean, think of so many examples come to my mind, whether it's aesthetic performances, whether it's the Shringar Rasa, where again Krishna becomes the divine and becomes the Nayaka, in a brief moment as well. Similarly, in the courts of the Mughal emperors also, there is so much of, prosperity, there's so much, but the harem is something that has them completely confused. And rather than maybe trying to leave that, what they have not seen as undiscussed, it kind of becomes their USP, what they write, because they think they know about those. But yeah, I think you're right, it's very, very cultural. It's to do with the fact that you have the power to describe somebody who might not even know what you're writing about them, because they can't read your language. For most, most people could not read French, Italian, or English, that other people were writing in, the travelers were writing in. Yes.
It's interesting. It's just the parallels, right? Even today, I remember 2 days ago, Shahryar Afridi, who was Pakistan's representative at the United Nations, he gets the opportunity to go to New York, and from there he's vlogging videos on how the girls and women in New York, they are so much worse off than the great lives women are living in Pakistan, how these women lack in cultural values, etc., etc. Like, it's always been the practice and continues till today for men to sort of describe places in sort of like the focal point being on the women of the places they're traveling to.
Yeah, that's actually, and also juxtaposing women constantly, actually, of one culture versus the other almost, kind of that kind of a contest in their heads.
And the moral values of the society is sort of like the woman becomes the main lens through which they try to evaluate the society and how. So it's the whole burden on that is on the woman.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I agree. That's a very good comparison, that's something that continues to happen in the 21st century.
And tell us more about like the culture and customs. Obviously, India had very specific cultural practices, our festivals and the traditions and everything. So when they came here without the context and a proper context and everything, how did they interpret these things? Was there a lot of misunderstanding? How did they take it? Was it a big cultural shock for them?
A lot of fascination also, actually. I find, so for example, Diwali will become a festival of lights for the grandeur and the celebration. And sometimes I think they wanted to kind of capture the general mood of the population and celebrations. Also, sometimes, some of them will kind of compare it. So somebody says it's like Roman carnival, So it's interesting, not Diwali, I think this is Holi. So they will compare people coming on the road, celebrating, meeting. So I think a lot of festivals, for example, Durga Puja, or other local regional festivals, also people gathering, rituals, other ritual practices. For example, Muharram is often talked about, the Tazia. So I think these are cultural details that were for some of them, of course, very new, and some people would have probably heard about them also, because some people come to India while they have traveled to other places also. So a lot of times there are comparisons, with these. I often find very interesting, when some of them do try. So Fanny Parks, this woman who comes, she has a very interesting poem she writes on Ganesha, and I like the fact that how there is an attempt to. I mean, of course, many of them do try, because these are the aspects that they are picking up. And what I found the most interesting is that how they pick up the details that people who are living through those times might not have. They might have thought, it's a very normal thing. It happens every day. But for these people, these are some small details would become a very big. So, for example, they will be more interested in what people are doing during a celebration, what so and so is doing, or which. So, if it's a celebration, in which corner what is happening, or fireworks. Sometimes they will go on describing the fireworks, in great detail, or sometimes they would try and read about the deity or the particular cause behind. So they often do end up writing, but again, not everybody would do that. But yeah, I think they also know that this kind of knowledge, is the kind of detail that people back in Europe would be interested, to know. So they do create these images. They do talk about these writings. And again, the festivals. And also remember, many of them are traveling through various parts of the country as well. So they will be, as it is, witnessing so many different festivals in different times of the years, and different regional variations of those festivals also. So I think it does come across as something, as you said, the colors and the various aspects, so very fascinatingly captured at times. Yes, I mean, they will not always be, I will not say precise, or might not always, but some of them do, try and go into deep into the basic stories. And I think also the Orientalists took a lot of interest, to people like William Jones and his entire group. So we do have people translating, proper texts, interacting with Brahmins and Maulavis. I'm sure, I mean, I imagine there would have been discussions on these matters also, which would have come up and would have been, more in the codifications of these religions and these writings. I wonder what would have been all that they would have discussed in these conversations.
So, yeah, that's what I was thinking. If you said these are meant for people back in Europe, so they are the audience. So if that's the purpose, then I could imagine there would be a lot of embellishment and exaggerations to make things more interesting. It just reminded me of the instance where, like the Jagannath festival, when some of the British accounts exaggerated to the extent that the rathas taking the deity would run over people, and thousands of people would be trampled by these rathas, and that sort of led to the evolution of the word to become Juggernaut, which was like an unstoppable force in English language.
Yes.
And
Yes.
so I would imagine a lot of these exaggerations happen. Can you think of like some places where these kind of exaggerations may have actually um, worked to the adverse effect in terms of like fueling into the racism which eventually developed? Um,
Um, I think, I mean, I would say that a lot of these gendered, writings, or even this impression of people, like, for example, overt sexuality. So at one point, they do want to sort of experience that, and as they come to India, and gradually they, what we call the Indianization has to happen, because they have to get comfortable with the life they're living here. For example, gradually they realize that they will have to have, more vegetable based diet, because the stomach ailments, liver ailments were troubling them. They'll have to wear cotton, because it's a fabric that will be more breathing kind of fabric, for them. So, those things are happening. But at the same time, when they talk about, for example, religion, there is always this underlying, fear of sexuality. For example, when they talk about things like Shivalingam, they wouldn't understand the symbolism, what it would have represented for people who would have, who would be worshipping it. And for them, it basically meant and kind of unbrindled kind of sexuality, or the idea of Devdasis, that in fact in my research I found very problematic. So for them, Devdasi was simply reduced to, by definition, they will confuse Devdasis with courtesans. Sometimes they'll confuse Devdasis, with prostitution. And I think, that kind of on one hand is misinformation, on the other hand, you're losing the history of individual who you are talking about, and third, I think it's fueling into this overtly sexual kind of image of people who are dark skinned, who are the other, who are holding women, so at some point it also becomes a little patriarchal. So somebody says that on the one hand they are hiding women, both Hindus and Muslims are putting women in seclusion, but they do not form a wrong impression of these women as well. So what does it mean? It means that women should be at some point. This one person is writing in 18th century who says that women, because they're kept inside the homes, they become dull, they don't have any knowledge, but they still have a lot of influences over their husbands. Now these are very contradictory statements. So similarly, in many writers you find these. So when you read these contradictions and the way most of the descriptions lead to this kind of very sexual sort of a portrayal, I think that feeds into this larger argument of Oriental being slow, being lazy, being licentious, them having more children or multiple wives. So these kind of sort of fuels into this, and what it does when we reach to the colonial era, actually it justifies the colonial enterprise for me. So when people it's not as unrelated, also it's not planned, no, I'm not saying it's planned, but it's interesting the way in which the Orient and the Occident are sort of so Indian history as unchanging, Indian women as unchanging. So I think this is the kind of, for me, it's the kind of exaggeration from the ruler to common people. So the way ruler is hiding the women behind the parda, so are the common people doing the same kind of thing. At the same time, women are bathing at ghats, so they're not able to sort of place it together, or maybe classify these as different lives and different life experiences, and maybe say that life can be as varied at places as it can be anywhere else. So there's kind of a monolithic description that they wanted to probably portray, which contradicts their own writing very often as well, is extremely problematic, I feel.
And like Indian history, when it comes to like study of Hinduism in the West, I think even till today, it's largely dominated by two things. One is caste system and one is the sati practice. Usually when you come across a Western, the only thing they know about Hinduism is that, yeah, caste and they had sati at some point. Was it at this time that the Britishers started making these observations and writing about them, that eventually these two aspects, which for us, they're not so dominant, but for them, but from a Western perspective, they are the most dominant aspects of Indian religion?
Um, I would say that I would not agree that they are not dominant. Sati, of course, is not, but caste system and the way it evolves in Hindustan, I think, has been a very, major sort of a social structure, in Hindustan. So much so that even religions that do not practice caste system, if you look at it, the way they have evolved, they have, begun to have their, these kind of caste distinctions, in their hierarchies as well. So what often I found was that with caste also they are very confused. So some of them will say there are 8 castes, some of them will say there are 10 castes, because the word caste itself is a Portuguese word, right? What the words that we have had are varna and jatis, which are also very complicated. I don't want to go into that, their history, but yes, the way they evolved, and there are the mixed castes, and and these are also have a historical trajectory to them. But to say that, for them, the most practical way in which they experience caste and its varied forms is when they are living in India. So those merchants, British or judges, officers, lawyers, service people, army people, when they come to live here and they have to hire their domestic help, people would refuse to do that work, that I can't do this, this is not the work of my caste. So they often write that their experience of caste in their own social spaces is when one particular person will only do one kind of work, because that's the work he's supposed to do. That work I cannot do. So they will have somebody to cook, then somebody to bring water, somebody to do only gardening. So these are the professional works. And I think this is something they do talk about as well. Of course, there is a lot of codification about caste system that is done in the 18th century as a part of this, now we are the administrators. So we will, write about that. And for me, I think the biggest loss in that is that they do write about, what they converse with, people at that time, but they don't talk about what people thought about themselves at that time. Imagine to have, an 18th century, Hindustani people telling us what they thought about them, because these travelers also took care to register their history, not of what they thought of their past only, but what was 19th century like for people who were living in India. So for me, I mean, I really wish. So yeah, I think, caste, I would say caste is, a very pertinent feature, of course. But yeah, I think the way they write about it, often without grasping its historicity at times. And so for their experience, it's in their household mostly that they experience the caste structure. Yes. I also wanted to talk about Sati a little bit here as well, and say that, Sati is again something that most of the European travelers are in awe of when they first see it, because whenever they will read other people's travelogues and writings, they would read about Sati. But to actually, when they write, and there are a lot of paintings of Sati as well, not just the English and the British, but also Dutch travelers, French travelers, they all talk about Sati. Now, what I found interesting in my reading of these descriptions was that Sati was, presented in the early writings as something, of course, they were horrified by it, but they were also in awe of it. But what I witness is in my reading that by the time they reach 19th century, most of the things that are banned or they are controlled by bringing laws, by bringing decrees, so Sati, anti-Nautch movement, these are all the things that at some point have been a fascinating, aspect for the Europeans. I will say all Europeans actually. So the paintings, sometimes, I mean, I remember seeing this painting where the woman is almost shown in action, almost jumping to the funeral pyre. So a lot of, those paintings will, for somebody who doesn't know a Sati, the entire thing, for them, it's like a creation of something very, very dramatic at times as well, I witnessed. But in 19th century, they are also trying to portray that we are the ones. So the judgmental and the kind of, value added, measure to it comes in the 19th century. And it often is exactly the same things that they found. So I will want to talk about Nautch if you give me some time to do so.
No, that I know you've done a lot of work in artisans and tabaras and all. We love to hear more about that as well.
I think what remains interesting is that a lot of work that was done on Europeans. Yeah, sorry.
Ruchika, just before you go on that, just want to clarify one point on Sati. Was it so common? Was it so prevalent that so many Dutch, French, and British were able to witness it? I mean, there were only a few thousand of them, I imagine, in those days. Was this practice happening so commonly that even foreigners were able to witness it?
I'm glad actually you asked that, because most of the people who are writing about it would also say that they actually have never themselves seen it. Okay. So yeah, so I would like to probably and each one of them will have a different version. So somebody will say only these castes will do this. Only in this region I've heard it happens more. But yeah, I don't think, except for maybe a handful of them, I don't think most people describing Sati would have actually. There's also one thing that I realized when I'm reading these travelogues. Many of these travelogues actually pick up certain details from previous travelogues. Yes. So, there is almost like they're building up on it. And again, I think it's very easy to make this statement in 21st century because they're looking back in retrospect, and that's the, privilege of historians. But people, when they're living through their times, I don't think things are as planned, because people are often reacting to the times without knowing what's going to happen the next. So most people who write about Sati have actually not witnessed it happening live as well. So yeah, so a lot of anecdotes. So about Job Charnock, the founder of Calcutta, we see that he saw Sati happening. He saved that woman and was in love with her, so got married to her. Something that the movie Mangal Pandey uses in the storyline in the Bollywood movie as well. So yeah, I think a lot of this also remains a kind of a fascination and a very chivalrous kind of a trope. Remember, medieval Europe has a lot of poetry, romantic poetry about the chivalry of men as well. So yeah, I think sometimes that also comes into play, because you can't forget where people are coming from, what's the literature they have read, and what kind of how they see themselves as well really matters.
So it's a little like every traveler going to Japan and coming back and saying, I saw geishas. So you sort of
No, but in
forward.
today's time, when we talk about geisha, we will be aware of that word. We will be aware of the politics, of their lives and their words, and we will not use certain value added, some kind of adjectives. We will be cautious of that. But yeah, when you read 16th, 17th century, I think so many adjectives. I think I should do a paper only on the adjectives there that are used, for women in at that time. So much. Value judgment, so much of morality, heavily loaded words of morality all the time.
Right. So yeah, so let's dive deeper into that. Let's talk about the women who were out there in the public space. We've talked about the harems. Now let's talk about the women that they could interact with, that they could actually meet, the Nautch women.
Now, before I go into Nautch women's this thing, I want to also say that interestingly, the way they sexualize women they could not see, they also sexualize the woman they could actually see. And I think very often when scholars say that empire is a masculine enterprise, I think, I get that. When you read these records, you understand that, and so Nautch becomes something that is very, very fascinating. So it becomes, for many scholars, becomes a social experience. So when they come and they see things like hookah, when they see things like pan, when they see things like servants waiting on them, and, be wearing an Indian costume, all these became not just an experience of the Orient or the experience of Hindustan. It also becomes the experience of the rich, the rich Indians, mostly the Mansabdars, the Mughal officers, Mughal emperors, Mughal Nawabs. And this also, before I go into Nautch girls, is something that I will talk about. This also gives birth to something called the Nabob. Nabob, the Nabob. It's like a very denunciatory, very mocked character. That how the British who are coming to India and they're going native is what they call it. They're going native, so they will you'll have their harems now. Practically speaking, not everybody could have had a harem, because it means to have an establishment which is huge, to have multiple partners, and similarly to have a household that huge. Only the elite British men very often, and in my wills I do have some people who have multiple wives. David Octel, in the Delhi Resident, is said to have been called Akhtar Looni by common people, who would travel on elephants with his entire harem of 12 or 13 wives or concubines. Very often the distinction is not made also. But having said that, what we do realize is that either ways women are being sexualized. So Nautch becomes as one of the experiences of this Nabob. That Nabob will be portrayed as smoking the hookah, which is again beautifully, it's not a simple hookah, it's beautifully maybe silver, very ornate, very intricate designs on it, and a very, very not just a smoking but also an appearance of royalty. Similarly, the idea of eating pan. Now, pan has all these ingredients that often have, very suggestive meaning behind them. So I was reading somewhere that how when Manuchi reaches Surat, he saw that people are spitting blood and gets very scared. What bimari, what kind of malady they have, why people spitting blood, only to find out that there's something called the betel leaf. It's eating of pan that people are spitting, the katha. And so when he's given the pan, he's offered the pan. Pan is usually offered, right? The ritual behind giving the pan, same as green tea in Japan. So he eats it and he's shocked by the first taste of pan. Must have been a very strong, strongly laden kind of pan. But yeah, so we do find them talking about these things, and at times telling us how shocked they were, or how distinct the taste actually was. For them it would have been very, very shocking. So similarly, one such experience was Nautch. When they see the Nautch women, and the fact that Nautch women were a part of the regular life. They were not the prostitute, who will have a separate place assigned. They will come to the households. They will come in all the pomp and glory. They will have all the beautiful fabrics, brocades, the zaris, the banarsis, zardozis, and whatnot. They'll have the most expensive jewelry, most fashionable jewelry, the velvets. Just imagine the kind of richness of all those fabrics to experience. Then they have their live taffy, they'll have their live musicians playing for them. And this kind of an experience was very new for them. And in my research, I realized that almost every European who comes to India will have something or the other to write about the Nautch women, because he would have experienced the Nautch performance live. Most of them, would have, because they will be invited to Zamindar's house. They would go to some royal or some, landlord's house where they'll experience the Nautch. Now, what remains interesting is that, they will talk about the Nautch women and somebody calls it pantomime, how they put too much makeup on, or how their gestures were suggestive. Now, so I have this passage which reads that how the slow playing music, where she's talking about desire. So I kept thinking maybe it was a thumri where the Naika is talking about, but that's the theme of the Shrangar Rasa, and how it kind of for them switches into that these women will then in the end will pick up a partner for the night. There might be a possibility that some of the Nautch women might be sex workers, but not all of them might be, and they will have particular patrons, so depending upon also the class of the Nautch women as well. So the music of the ghungroos becomes sluggish movements, and I kept thinking nothing in their movement is sluggish. It's so fast, the twirls and everything. Not only Kathak, in fact, a lot of time folk music intertwines. Yes, Kathak, of course, in part of northern India, but different kinds of music, light music as well, thumri and everything. Because, the Indian aesthetic has this idea that whatever expression and bhav you are presenting, emotion, the audience should feel that while watching your performance. So if it is based on erotic, the people will enjoy that aspect. I think without necessarily understanding that, their experience of it is very different. And when women writers talk about it, so, the women writers will say that Nautch is very nice when all the audiences are male. When the women are there, it's a little discomforting for both the women viewers as well as the women performers. I'm wondering what, I imagine what that could actually mean. So sometimes it's also juxtaposing the white woman and the Nautch women, for the attention of the white man as well. I think there's this incident that is mentioned in Surat, where it's a very popular trope actually in the writing, that how an Indian man offers his wife to the white man, and after having spent the night with the white man, the wife doesn't want to go back to the Indian man. Now, I'm not sure whether it could have been. Maybe. I don't know. But what it tells me as a historical anecdote mentioned by a European man is again this kind of the power authority by the sexual prowess of a white man being superior to that of a man in India. So there are these kind of tropes also where through Nautch the idea. So Nautch is licentious and at the same time sluggish, whereas some European men absolutely adore. Some of them understand the difficulty of the dance form. They understand the hold over the music performing on. So, again, so somebody, Bishop Heber, for example, he praises this bronze tint of these women's skin, which is equally patronizing, not to praise that, that praise. It also has a context. But yeah, I think what I want to also says that the experience of the reader of all these travelogues also remains very different. It's gendered, it's often racialized without having necessarily the racism that we understand in the context of 19th century, but the awareness of the other, this constant awareness of the other. So yeah, Nautch girls become a little threatening also. They're also becoming sexually alluring. At the same time, they carry this idea of an integral part of their experience while they live in India. And the nabob, the critical nabob, the British who are enamored by the Indian lifestyle by the last decade of 18th century. For them, they also host these Nautch, and there are paintings. I wish I could have shown the paintings, but yeah, there are paintings of them enjoying this.
So these nabobs are essentially British men who have become accustomed to the lives of wealthy Indians, be it getting addicted to things like Nautch or pan or hookah or sort of whatever you consider like the customary habits of the Indian nabobs. So they are sort of like imitating the actual Nawabs. And I think once they can get back to England, they're not able to let go these habits. So they sort of take some of this culture back there, and they're ridiculed there for their having been spoiled so much in the ostentatious lives of India. But I want, but the thing you mentioned about these Nautch women, that's interesting. That people who were not accustomed to seeing women in public life, such as back in Europe, um, it would be interesting that they are these women who are independent, financially independent. They're organizing their own mujras or the shows. They are collecting money. They own their property and everything. So even just their very existence would have felt a bit threatening to people who come from a society where women had no property rights or education rights or anything of the sort, right? And the only way to down these women would be to brand them as sex workers. So that is the only way for somebody who's not accustomed to seeing a financially independent woman performer would be to sort of level it, make sense of all of that is to brand her as a sex worker.
I think I would not say that women in public spaces were not there, in Europe. I think they were, which is why it often used to perturb the white men, or British men and others as performers, as performers. Yeah, so it was very disturbing for them that the Indian elite could talk to British women, but they could not talk to the Indian elite women. It's often like a pet peeve of theirs as well. Yeah, what does happen is that in this European sort of cultural spaces, the public women are usually women who are sex workers, right? And to have women who own the cultural spaces, the women who are and different dance forms. So there's a Devdasis in South India. I will not go into that detail here, but yes, in so many ways they are the ones who have continued the culture of yes. Again, I think there's a lot of very political. I will not say they are just that, but one aspect is that similarly as the Nautch women also, I think the Nautch women were a lot more, not always very affluent only, Ajur. Some of them will not be so affluent as well. At times they will be performing in smaller spaces. But yeah, the cultural acceptance that the Nautch women would get, that they would be invited to events. So no cultural event in a way would be complete in a house of a landlord without, or wedding, or a child's, any function related to the family. So on good occasions, how they will always be a part of the celebration and the social spaces. They were not condemned, but they were actually celebration. So they were celebratory aspect of the social life in India. That would have been a very, I think, perturbing kind of thing for them. Yes, definitely.
These are family occasions like childbirth or a birthday or a wedding. So then here their role is not so much of a sex worker, right? It's more a role of a performer.
Yeah, they are artists, and they are valued for their art, because so much of these classical songs, if you hear, they were very tough to. So you can imagine the kind of training they would have got to. They will have these ustads who would have taught them these, to even perform the dance, and to have singers singing with them, people who are playing the percussion. Each person would have expertise in actually playing, the instrument, and singing and dancing what they were doing. A lot of rehearsals would have taken place. So yeah, I think for me, they are dancers, artists, people who continued, a lot of music that comes to us through 18th and 19th centuries.
And you mentioned that some of these Nawabs would take on multiple women, or have, at least the very wealthy ones would have their own harem and have multiple wives. Was polygamy common in India at the time? Like, how did they get that whole concept of taking on multiple wives? Was it a common practice to have multiple wives?
I think historically, if you see, I think multiple wives, the polygamy, I think has been there in many cultures, not just in Hindustan, but in many cultures. I would also not just associate it with any particular religion. I think it's a lot also to do with class, and also a lot of times to do with the idea of prestige. Because remember, many a times the idea of masculinity also gets sort of enhanced when you talk about a person with multiple, married or unmarried sexual partners. It's gendered. I think one has to keep that in mind too. But yeah, I think many a time what I find when I read, these records is a lot of exaggeration. So the number of, again, they do not have any way of knowing exactly how many. So these numbers, often when you pick up the bazaar gossip, but people are just generally talking and you pick it up, you tend to pick up and maybe write about it also for the effect of what it will have. Wow, this many, that kind of effect that it would have on the readers. But yeah, I think again, and even when I work on the mixed race marriages and mixed race relationships, we do have many British men who have multiple partners, at times at different points and at times simultaneously as well. And when you read their letters and when you read their diaries sometimes, so they would talk about, this is written in many sources, that how it's easier to have an Indian partner than to have a British partner. Because obviously, if I have a British partner, you'll be shopping for certain kind of food, you'll be buying certain kind of hats, because their lifestyle will be all be imported from outside, right? But if you have a partner who's from India, probably she would have things available, and she'll, so a lot of times the language, so she's called the housekeeper or washerwomen. Of course, these are concubines of men who are lower class in their social and economic ladder. But yeah, I think polygamy is also should be seen as a issue of who would have those elaborate households and who would not have such elaborate households. And maybe also not everybody's life gets mentioned in these travelogues as well. So to make kind of a sociological kind of a statement based only on travelogues, but I think for me also will be a little for a historian, a little discomforting to just do something like that.
Absolutely. And you mentioned mixed race marriages. How were these marriages treated? Like, were they accepted by the Indian and English societies? And how were the children of mixed race children treated?
Actually, mixed race relationships are not all marriages. In fact, in my experience, most of them, were conjugal relationships, which had the acceptance and, and even the European travelers who are coming here, even in 18th and early 19th century, are often very surprised, because this kind of thing doesn't happen back at home. This could also be an issue of, this is also an issue of race and hierarchy, because these are essentially asymmetrical relationships, right? And I often find the mention of allowances. So again, I want to blur this line that a woman who's a concubine would also be, for a lower class British man, a woman who will be taking care of his household when he's unwell, his needs, especially the men in the army. They often say that every soldier in British army is provided, with a washerwoman or a housekeeper. So the British man's own class that he belongs to will also make an impact. So there are, of course, rich men, like you have William Palmer, who's painting he also used, where he has his partner Faiz Baksh. And I love that painting because he's looking at her so lovingly, and the entire family is there. So we do have some very famous relationships. For example, William Dalrymple talks about the Kirkpatrick family, but it's not that kind of atmosphere for the middle and lower middle class or lower class British men. For them, and we also have these marriages or these relationships, let's say, because in today's time, marriages is how people want to view them as. Sometimes people don't want to accept that, people were living without getting married. I said, yeah, this is what was very, very common. So for Indians, it was not a problem, and nor was it a problem for the Europeans, because remember that these men are coming to India and they're young men. So they would want a kind of an emotional, personal kind of attachment, and of course sexual, right? And the children that were born in these relationships, we see, again, depending on the class of the British man, and if somebody will sponsor the child, sometimes the children were sent back home. In fact, I think till 1780s and even 90s, a lot of men who could afford most of the children, and they will say home will mean the children. So typical patrilineal structure, that the child will belong to the father. Also probably because these women could go to one to other man. This was a soluble relationship. Women could walk out of the relationship, and men could also end that relationship as well. So I have a very interesting well where this woman is mentioned with 4 aliases, the surnames. So Elizabeth Cordroy, Elizabeth so and so. and you realize that that woman actually must have lived with a different British male partners, and for legal clarity, the current partner who's leaving some money for her in the will wants to specify that she is the right woman I'm speaking about. And children are often left property in the wills. They are also mentioned, and I think it does become a bigger concern, gradually, once the concern of race, the concern of mixed race, the idea of mixed blood, and the word miscegenation comes to have a very negative connotation. Until then, there's not much hullabaloo about these. And then we have the emergence of a lot of the orphanages, schools for these both men and women. Many a times, if the daughters were fair complexion, the mixed race daughters, they were married off to the British soldiers. So these kind of concerns of race, even in the documents like wills, kind of come across as late as 18th and 19th centuries. But yeah, mixed race marriages, my conclusion is that mixed race marriages do not stop by early 19th century because of these concerns of racial divisions and differences. I think people stop mentioning those concubines and those mixed race relationships.
You mentioned that from the Indian standpoint, people were fine with these live-in relationships between white English man and Indian woman. How is that? We don't find Indian society that open to this kind of thing even today. How were they so okay with it back in 1700s?
In one of these court cases that I saw, this woman called Piru Bibi, who lived with this man Henry Pine, and it comes to a very negative ending, and the woman leaves him. He comes into her house, breaks into her house, and steals the jewelry from the house. So it goes to the court. This is 1790s sometimes. Now, in the court case, we hear Piru Bibi's brother and sister saying that Piru Bibi was the sole bread earner of the family, as the concubine of these. So the sister says that how she had lived with previous British masters, and the jewelry that Henry Pine had stolen was not given by Henry Pine, but was given to her by her previous British, partners. So now when we see these, I think one has to also probably look at these women who were probably living in the capacity of domestic and sexual workers with them, or they were domestic partners with multiple dimensions to the relationships. Again, I don't have a monolithic sort of an answer to that question, depending totally upon the role. So there are, Indian concubines who will have multiple servants. They are sort of looking after the man, has multiple servants, and there are houses, small establishments where the woman is the one who's taking care of everything as well. So I think, probably depending also upon the caste, class, locations of these women as well, that they should have been seen as women who were domestic workers with multiple roles to play. Her sexual reproductive role also should be considered in the house of the British man as well. Of course, there would have been emotional interpersonal attachments also, but they always, in my research at least, I've always come across the mention of the wages or the mention of some allowances to be given to these women. Sometimes maybe due to attachments, they're also given pensions, and some of these relationships last 18 years, etc. So again, one has to keep in mind the variety of experiences they would have had for most of these people as well.
So if I understand it, the relationships, the interracial relationships that were there at the time were more driven by necessity, men needing the emotional and physical, their need of a companion, and for women, a lot of times that as well as financial needs. But there wasn't really an openness to interracial marriage. It sounds like there wasn't even a thought process around something like this. We should organize interracial marriages. That sort of never existed.
I think it's actually more complex than I can probably say it in 5 minutes or something. So, for example, in 1687, the board of directors, the English board of directors, they actually encourage this kind of a thing because there's also the fear of homosexuality. What if British men turn to one another for physical, emotional, all kinds of comfort? So the concubinage was seen as the lesser evil of the two. There is also sometimes the concern with, the children who were born between when Portuguese men live with the women, and how the child will be, will be Catholic, whereas the British would have wanted the child to be Protestant. So that kind of subtle European kind of contest would have also been there as well. So a 5 pagoda was given as an incentive to those men who will, get their child to the church, their mixed race child also. But despite that, what I find interesting is that, in the baptism records of those mixed race children, if the mother was unmarried and native women, native is a very broad category. Anybody who's not totally white, even mixed race, will be native. So this, you can imagine how interesting race is emerging by 18th, 19th century. So against the name of the mother, there's a question mark, because their marriages had not taken place and because she was native. Many times we do have marriages taking place as well. Not always, but yes, at times, marriages take place too. Many wills will have a long description that I am not married to her, but our love and relationship and the family is nothing less than. So, for example, the European women also who are coming, they say that some kind of agreement takes place between them, because nobody treats these relationships anything less than marriage. Because for a European mind, centrality of marriage is much more than it is to an Indian mind, apparently. But again, we don't hear the Indian perspective. We are looking at European records. So yeah, I mean, I think I cannot say it with all the confidence as I can say for how British would have seen it. Actually.
So you mentioned like instead of when the woman was of native, or at least a mixed native origin, then they would not even name the mother. They would just put a question mark in the records. So it seems like that racial differences were very important for them, even in the early period. So was there always a sense of being racially superior, even when they were not economically and politically superior?
I think more than racial, it was civilizational superiority. That sense was always there. As I told you, that they never see themselves as, they say, Hindu era of Indian history and Muslim era. They see themselves as British era. So they were, I think, always aware of a civilizational superiority, which is why whenever they mention anybody who's black and brown or yellow, as they call us, and other ethnicities and regions, they always use the word barbarians, barbarous culture. And it always I should have mentioned it when I mentioned Sati. The witch burning is happening in Europe at the same time. I mean, England, I think, has I think, if I'm not wrong, recently they've kind of issued an apology, or have they not yet, on people they declared witches, most of whom were women. So I was wondering, how come they didn't remember of witch burning when they saw Sati, or when they thought of Sati? Doesn't come across, So I think a lot of it is civilizational. For me, race becomes an issue more and more as we go to the end of 18th century. Before that, there is a racial separatedness and an awareness, but it's based for me on a civilizational superiority. The idea of, even scientific researches and queries about blood, purity of blood, they are more 19th century product, which then lead to, this whole fascism and Nazism and this idea of this other blood, that other blood kind of a thingy. No, but I think by 18th century, I'm not sure if that's so much only a race. Even if it is racial differentiation, it's based, for me, it's very civilizational actually than anything else. I also want to bring in something else here, which I mentioned. I mentioned homosexuality, and that is something very, very feared. So concubinage is seen as accepted evil, but not homosexuality. In fact, there have been works by I think Ronald Hyam and E.M. Collingham, which talk about so much of fear of homosexuality, and this idea that they established something called the Lal Bazaars, which were regimental prostitution. Where there'll be some prostitutes who will be hygienically taken care of. They will have regular testings, etc. But they will only cater to the white clientele. Shumanto Banerjee has some very interesting work on this, others too, but I just thought of that work. So the fact that to those women will be restricted to not sleep with the Indian clientele, but this was done again. I mean, imagine to have and then they have these Venereal Diseases Act and all those things. Then it gradually, when you move to 19th century, you have the Anti-Nautch Act and so much of morality. So all the things that the travel writings talk about, up till 18th century, even early 19th century, gradually how those things of fascination mostly are the things that need to be stopped, that need to be regulated, because that's how a colonial structure functions. It functions by regulating things. It functions by organizing. So even the sexuality of the men has to be, the British men has to be sort of organized. These women have to be made accessible, to them. But yeah, I think the larger fear is also homosexuality. There's a huge fear of homosexuality.
Was it common at the time?
Sorry, I think I lost your voice.
No. I'm back now.
Yes.
I'm just curious, was it common at the time? So, like, obviously, we know from the British writings of this period that a lot of British men would choose to move away from Europe and go to places like Persia and all, where the attitude was much more open to homosexuality. But was that happening towards India also? Were men coming to India just because India was more open to homosexuality?
I will say gender fluidity. I mean, because again, one doesn't get too many references, about these in the European sources, and which is exactly why when very often we see the portrayal of the harem, a lot of homoerotic element is there, but it's not the homoerotic element from the purpose of getting to know about something. It remains heavily addressed towards male gaze for me. Also, I think a lot of times it also leads to,
so like women sexuality between two women partners, which is more addressed towards a male gaze.
No, they will not talk about homosexual. They'll talk about homoerotic. So the way the harem is represented, it's shown. So women are, sexually starved, sexually depraved. Women are only dressing up for the attention of their male partner. Whereas if you look at, the history, and if you look at the writings of these women, for example, writings of women like Jahan Ara or Noor Jahan's poetry. Now there are historians who say Noor Jahan would write poetry. Jahan Ara has some amazing risala, some letters that she wrote, and she's extremely aware of how she belongs to this family of Timuria, powerful family with both spiritual and political roles. So rather than going into what they had to say for themselves, you create this image of how many lovers were hidden and sent into Jahan Ara's harem, how many lovers were hidden and sent into Roshan Ara's harem, and how Aurangzeb came and heard about it, heard he was hiding in the boiler in the hammam. So he said, boil the water for me. And the poor chap was boiled with the water. And I can't imagine a place as formalized as, based on etiquette and quote, politeness. Jahan Ara was respected so much by everybody. She was Sahibe Jahan in the harem. I can't imagine Aurangzeb coming to her quarters and saying that, I know that somebody is hiding or alluding towards that. But look at the way it is portrayed. So I think similarly, even the mention of homosexuality or homoeroticism in the Islamic empires also becomes not a open-mindedness on the part of this writing, but also a way to critique the a very anti-Islamic sort of a critique also of how these rulers are less vicious. Somebody I was reading in the morning, 17th century description that how the Mughal emperors have women in their harem and also younger men. Now, without knowing the exact admiration for young boys, that is very culture specific. I think it's a very kind of harsh statement to make. Also, to say that Shah Jahan died of an unmentionable kind of a disease, again alluding to without any proof again. So I think these kind of references, Yajur, for me adds to this very a very typical image of these big empires. So you are kind of trying to also write through your writing that these empires might be grand, but see, these are also these kind of things to be kept in mind. I find it very morally judging sort of a writing.
Yeah, to scandalize it. It's sort of like if somebody from here goes
Scandalized.
to Hollywood or Los Angeles, he'll come back with so much scandal to share. Even if he sees nothing, he'll make up what he's looking for. Okay, I think as we're moving towards closing time, I want to bring up some audience questions.
Please.
I have a question from Tanishq Awasthi who wants to ask you your view. What were the British views on pre-colonial Indian education system?
See, regarding the education system, again, they refer a lot, to the caste structures of education, and often make statements like how women are not educated. Again, this is not something that I have done my research on, but when I do look at these sources, there is a mention of certain cities and certain places which have a historical importance in terms of centers of learning, centers of culture. So there is awareness, I think, also because remember, some of them are travelers or as officers or as merchants. They're also constantly traveling. So they do pick up the information based on which areas they are traveling to, how they are traveling, and some of them who were very well versed in the local languages, not very well versed, but the ones who could speak the local languages, they would be able to gather more information about these details and individuals if they interact with them. But not all of them would get a chance to do so. But yeah, they do talk about some of the regions, some of the cities, which educational centers, and some of the structures and system. But yeah, they also talk about women as not having been educated, which is, I think, not entirely true also, because there would have been certain kind of education at the home or some kind of homeschooling, I think, for different families. But again, these details are difficult to sort of find out in these travel writings until and unless a traveler would have been specifically interested to talk about them.
Understood. And was it common practice back in those days for women in England to be educated?
Yes, I think women in England definitely had far more education, but yeah, not as much as, of course, as with time permitting, because we do know of many women who were writing with male names or male aliases. So the fact that women were being educated, but they did not, their education was not accepted to be as important as that of men, or they were not performing public roles or getting a job. But that's post industrialization kind of feature probably as well. And then the women's rights movement, of course, made a huge difference to that. But yeah, even in terms of property rights, so if a woman gets married, the law of I think conventure, the property will then go to the husband of even the wife. So these kind of rules, I think, if you read Pride and Prejudice and all these books, I think we realize that a lot of this is referred to in these very interesting novels as well.
I have another question from Noble Srivastava. Can you please talk a bit about English women's perception towards Nautch performances? I think you talked a little bit already. How do we study the shift in their attitude towards these women? So how do this all over time?
I think, women start to travel to India much later, compared to men traveling towards these parts. But yeah, I think I thought I'll read some passages, but I'm not sure if we have the time to do so. Let me look up if I can. So these experiences definitely do remain gendered. So I'm reading Mrs. Kindersley, who calls Nautch the favorite and most constant amusement of the great. She goes on to say why this entertainment is delightful to the eyes of European men. And I'm quoting, "There are many proofs that Europeans do not think them, the Nautch girls, altogether intolerable. Time and custom reconciles them to the yellow and black," which is a reference to the color of the skin, "which at first sight appears frightful. It is their Nautch girls' languishing glances, wanton smiles, and attitudes not quite consistent with decency, which are so admired and whoever excels most in these is the finest dancer. I mean, how heavily loaded, is this reference? I wish I had more from. So Mrs. Sherwood also talks about, she writes, she calls the charms of the Indian Nautch girls as an intoxication or witchcraft, the sense of those who came within its charmed circle, not unlike that of an intoxicating drug or that of what is written of the wiles of witchcraft, unquote. Now, I think Mrs. Sherwood has also, she's a very religious kind of a person. So she has a very different kind of attitude towards arts in general, I have a feeling. But yeah, I think very often what I feel is that when white women are traveling, when the Imam Sahib comes to India, and a lot of research has happened on this. So I'm quoting from those researchers, and I completely agree that she also carries a burden. She carries the burden of not just her gender, but also of her race. Ultimately, she's sent here as a white woman. So it's expected, there's this quote I read somewhere which said, white men can only remain what they are under the gaze of their women. So women have this moral responsibility to get the men on the right path. So sometimes I also feel whether what we are reading from these women's writings is actually as open-mindedly spoken, or they also have a certain duty to play. So I find it very double-edged sword, because many a times people who have this nostalgia and romance of the mixed race relationships, they will say, oh wow, we were living so happily with the British, the Indians and British were living so happily, this cross-cultural relationships. These Mem Sahibs came and they spoiled everything for us, as if the Mem Sahib is coming from no cultural context, So yeah, I think the Mem Sahib is also sent here with a certain sense of responsibility that you are the women, which I think I often see in today's. I like what Yejur does. He keeps on comparing it to present scenario. We expect women to do the right thing and women to bring the men on the right path. This very typical Bollywoodish, get a man married, she'll bring him, as if she's an emotional therapy for the men, So this kind of expectation, which is racial and gendered, I think was also there from the white women. I'm not sure many of them would have, if they enjoyed the Nautch, would have been able to say that in their writing. So yeah, I think we need to also understand that white women also are coming from a particular context. As for example, women like Mrs. Kendersley also meets these women when she goes into the harem, and she talks about how beautiful these women are, these Indian women, but then also says, oh, they put too much of makeup, everything is made up, without realizing the cultural context of that, or maybe without realizing that certain parts of jewelry, or what they would be on their bodies is a cultural what is expected, of course patriarchal, but expected of women, to adorn on their bodies. Without that kind of a interaction, we also find, yeah, I think when we reach a later period, when there are more and more white women coming, yes, I think there is a change, and there are some, I'm not sure if I'll remember, but there are movies and novels like Heat and Dust, which talks about this fascination this woman has. And this is of course a work of fiction, where she has an affair with a brown Nawab. But yeah, I think maybe we need to study more about these women's experiences, if we can find out and scrape out some interesting aspects that might be hinted in their writings. But yeah, I think they also have a burden of race and gender, and the expectations of race and gender on them, actually.
That's actually very interesting. So from the very beginning, when these women were sent to India, they were sent with the clear objective of preventing the Englishmen from Indianizing, from becoming too. So there was clearly a part of their responsibility to tell them that stick with your English traditions and English culture, because everything here is debaucherous and decadent. So even if they would find women beautiful, they would still say, oh, but that's not good to look beautiful because they're putting makeup or whatever.
Yeah, you find references like, women have cut the eyes. Now I was so scared when I read that. And I actually went on looking around. I looked everywhere for references. Is there a practice to cut the corners of the eyes? Yes, people put kajal to make eyes. I mean, in dance and Kathak, Bharatanatyam, all dance forms, we do that, because the audience sits far away. But yeah, I never found, but how can somebody write a reference so casually that women cut the eyes to make more room to move their eyes around? So again, but I don't think it was done very deliberately, Yajur. I don't think women were given like but I think this is expected of them. These are these gendered expectation of how women should be, what does a good woman do. These are, I think, very culturally conveyed to, I think, in our the way we are fashioned and the way we are brought up in our. There's also something called fishing fleet. So women who could not find husbands back in Europe, they were sent to India that go and find white husbands there. So I mean, so they were sent here, and it was called fishing. That these women are coming to fish for husbands. Again, very very derogatory and very sort of, I mean, without measuring the words. So we have a lot of these. Even white women, I think, were as much being framed by this kind of colonial experience as were the native women were, I think.
And do you have any like writings of the white women getting attracted to the local men, and any relationships where you had these women who came looking for English husbands but ended up co-inhabiting with somebody local? Or was beyond the realm of the possible time for them?
I think that kind of is an anxiety that is often portrayed. If you remember this movie called Junoon, because there's a lot of references to violence in 1857 against the white woman. So this, if you have not seen the film, watch the film. It's based on Ruskin Bond's story, Flight of the Pigeons. So this anxiety of and how similar this anxiety is to this idea of the upper caste woman marrying a lower caste man, which is still there in Indian society. How it's the same way there. So the lower caste women will be made available for an upper caste man, that's permitted, but so anulom vilom vivah ki jo baat hoti hai. But in case of also the white woman and brown man, this similar kind of a racial anxiety and a fear is there. Even if there were such relationships, Yajur, I wonder where will we find them in the records and sources. In 1857, the fear is there. So, I mean, maybe somebody would have worked, or somebody does work on this, but I haven't come across that in the sources that I have seen.
Ruchika, this was a very enjoyable conversation. Before we end, I just want to ask you one last question. In your in extensive study of all these travelogues and wills, can you share one interesting experience, like one interesting anecdote that you found that you'd like to share with us today? Any anecdote?
Okay, I know, I really don't like to romanticize my wills because I work on legal papers and there's so much of violence, also in the legal papers, disputes. Of course, affection, not so much of it, but there's one will where actually there are many wills, but there are one or two wills where there's a long description of the relationship that the man shares with his native partner. And there's one will where he wants to say that how he's not able to leave the money that he should have left to his relatives and to his mother, and how he is leaving the same amount of money to his mother as he leaves for his concubine with whom he has children. And he says that please understand that if I don't leave money for her and my children, they will be desolate. They will have nothing to fall back upon. And I thought that will is not a kind of place to have such a conversation. Will is like, give this much to this person, give this to that, this belongs to them, this silver jewelry to this. No, this actually reads like an emotional conversation which is happening with a man who probably is going to die in India, and the family who's back in Europe, who he has not met after, since he must have left that place to come here. And he says my relatives will probably be very angry that how can I place my mother and my concubine on the same platform. But one, this is nothing less than marriage because it's continued for so long, and I hold her in high esteem. And so for me, the interesting thing is how history has a way of making itself visible even in the sources that are explicitly not for emotional and love declarations. For me, this was also not just love, it's also familial emotional attachment. It's also a sense of responsibility towards the mother, maybe cousins, uncles, nephews, and nieces who would have been expecting, oh, he has gone to the land of riches, he'll send us something now. And here he's leaving everything for his wife, I mean, who he considers, his partner, native partner, who's been living with him for such a long era. So I do think that, history has a lot to offer, Yajur, provided that we, one, trust historians. We trust that people who have spent 30, 40, 50 odd years, in working on the craft of history writing will have a lot more to say and to be able to write about that. Not to say you should not read history and write history, but trust the historians a little bit more, because when we go around looking for history, we are not just doing that to earn quick fame. We're also doing that because it's a passion that has made us into historians. Despite all our family asking us, why are you studying history? Why are you studying history? We are stuck to the field. Also try and read the books of historians, because a lot of information out there on WhatsApps, is as something that anybody can write. So to be able to judge a source itself, to be able to critically evaluate a source. So whatever source I'm reading, I am telling you 100% the historian will be able to praise and critique the source in the same breath. And that's how history, we don't have opinions, we have perspectives. So yeah, I think that's what I would want to end on. Trust the historians and their research and their passion and love for their craft that they have been honing and continue to will hone till they die, probably, as well.
Thank you, Ruchika. It was a pleasure to have you with us. We hope to have you again for another interesting conversation. Thanks a lot, Ruchika.
Thanks for having me. And I just want to say that I'm sure I've not been able to do justice with such complex themes and issues. What I have been able to probably say is, highlight certain aspects of it. But yeah, there is a lot more to be said, many more complexities. History doesn't have easy answers, and it should not have easy answers also, I feel.
That's brilliant. Thank you. Thanks once again.
Thank you so much.